Welcome. I'm Sebastian Mahfood, and you're listening to WCAT Radio, the on-air wing of En Route Books and Media, bringing you the dulcet sounds of Catholic wisdom.
Jim Hanink here with co-host Mario Ramos-Reyes and special guest Samantha Delfin. We'll be discussing the new Vatican document, Male and Female, He Created Them. But first, let's begin with a prayer. Come, Holy Spirit, fill the hearts of your faithful and kindle in them the fire of your love. Send forth your Spirit, and they shall be created, and you will renew the face of the earth. Lord, by the light of the Holy Spirit, you have taught the hearts of your faithful. In the same Spirit, help us to relish what is right and always rejoice in your consolation. We ask this through Christ our Lord. Amen. Our guest, Samantha Delfin, has just finished her work for a master's in theology at Holy Apostles College and Seminary in Cromwell, Connecticut. Her dissertation topic is Mind over Matter in relation to gender dysphoria. Samantha, if I may, how did you choose this topic?
Sure. Great question. First off, I want to say thank you so much for having me on the show. It's a real honor and privilege to be able to contribute to the conversation, the research that I've done. But the reason I picked this topic is because, for pastoral reasons mostly, I serve in middle school youth ministry. And so the question of gender identity is very applicable to the teens that I serve with and to the families that I walk with in this question of figuring out who we are in the eyes of God. And so to have the theological background was really important for me in order to approach this pastorally sensitive topic. And in addition to that, I wanted to help create a resource for my fellow co-workers in the vineyard, my brother priests, and for the lay people who also serve in ministry, to give them a resource to give a foundational understanding of what gender dysphoria is and what the Lord has revealed to us through his teachings and development of doctrine through time. So I've done that in order to just hopefully contribute to the whole church community.
Well, what you're doing, Samantha, in education tells us why, perhaps, that it's the Department of Education, if we could use that expression. Mm-hmm. The Department of Education at the Vatican, the Holy See, has issued a document that's closely related to what you're doing, and no doubt you're interested in the document. We certainly are. The title is
definitely, yeah.
The title is Male and Female, He Created Them. And in the context of that document, maybe you could get us started once again with the idea that in dialogue, our motto should be to listen, to reason, and to propose. What does that mean for us and for you?
Yeah, I really appreciate that model that they followed in the document. To listen, to reason, and propose. Those are the three sections that they've just divided the document into. And it's reminiscent of the walk to Emmaus, I think, where our Lord came to the disciples in their anguish and in their hopelessness and listened to their situations in life and really sympathized with what they were feeling, what they were experiencing, what they were understanding. And from there, he brought them to Scripture, and reason and revelation tell us a lot about what the natural order is laid out before us and how that points to our purpose as men and women. And then the Lord proposes and gives them some guidance in interpreting the Scriptures and kind of trying to make things clear for them. So listening is a huge theme, I think, especially in youth ministry as of late. The new document that Pope Francis put out, Christus Vivit, talks a lot about listening, as well as the post-synodical document from the gathering that the bishops had on youth, young adults, and vocations recently. So the documents talk a lot about how the church is looking for, or youth are looking for people who listen. So it's a great way to take that step in evangelization.
All right, that gives us some insight right there. Now, Mario, I think as a long-time teacher, can maybe unpack for us the claim that the document makes. Let's say it's a comprehensive claim. And Mario, I'm going to read this comprehensive claim. Effective sex education must consider the totality of the person and insist, therefore, on the integration of the biological, psychoaffective, social, and spiritual elements. That's not going to make a good song title, but it must mean something. What does that mean, Mario?
Well, it seems to me that this is an exam, a test. But nevertheless, when I was reading this document, what I found is, I think an intuition or perhaps a claim made at the beginning of the document, which says that we are in an educational crisis. And that crisis is very noticeable on the anthropological dimension, or very clearly says on the field of affectivity and sexuality. Mm-hmm. So, but I would suggest that after listening to this claim that you just read, that the crisis go beyond that, go toward the lack of a clear anthropology, conception of what a human being is or a human person is, which is an integrated whole, which entail, as you said, not only the psychological aspect, not only the biological aspect, but also the spiritual aspect of the person. So the I is embedded in all these dimensions, so that the person can have not only feel his affectivity, his knowledge, and he has this dynamism proper to human person. So if we just detach any analysis of, in this case, gender theory from complete, if you will, view of the person, we may not have the complete picture. So underneath this analysis should be, I think, a theory of personalism of men and women. That's my, in a nutshell, my reading of that claim.
There's a lot there, and you're emphasizing just how much that is, and the focus, of course, is the person. Now, this document, not surprisingly, has been criticized. Some people say that this document allows for, encourages, requires even dialogue, where dialogue is simply a kind of failure, really, to be clear about what the teaching of the church is. And others have said this document is mistaken because it fails, really, to listen to, in particular, transsexual people, fails to listen to them, and will not lead to any dialogue at all. And I suppose what we want to say, I'm not sure you'll agree with me, but I suppose what we want to say is sometimes dialogue is possible and sometimes it's not possible. I think we certainly found that in other contexts in which dialogue was pursued. For example, the context of Christian Marxist dialogue. However, there are two statements in the document itself that maybe can give us some insight into where dialogue is possible and where it's not possible. Here's a statement, first of all. I'm sorry that I can't give a whole paragraph, but it's hard to follow all of this when it's being read. At one point, the document says, other work on gender has been carried out, which tries instead to achieve a deeper understanding of the ways in which sexual difference between men and women is lived out in a variety of cultures. So the document prior to that has said sometimes the analysis that we're working with is wholly sociological and wholly empirical. And then it says, and I'll read this passage again, however, other work on gender has been carried out, which tries instead to achieve a deeper understanding of the ways in which sexual difference between men and women is lived out in a variety of cultures. When we think of that work, and maybe some examples will come to mind, when we think of that work, is dialogue possible? Either of you, what do you think?
So just before, and I have a question for Samantha.
Yes, sir.
Before going into the dialogue, what that document provoked me is the question. Because if we begin with listening, I just put myself in the place of a teacher who walked to a class and tried to convey what he proposed to a number of students who may not know anything about the faith, may not know anything about philosophy, and yet they are experiencing in themselves all these trends or views, or in their own experiences, they are feeling this crisis of identity. So if I go there and begin with a proposal without knowing really what the question of my students are, then probably I'm going to answer a question before they were asking the question. And so that they will feel, I think correctly, that I'm imposing on them something that they didn't ask for. So I think the first step of listening, see what reality is all about, try to weigh the pros and cons of the question so that you can come with something to redirect the question or try to somehow handle the question, then you engage in a dialogue. And I think that is, I would say, very democratic, if I can use this term.
Yeah.
And how do you, and Samantha, you are, I think you are a millennial, right?
Yes.
And so how do you see that approach? Do you think it's appropriate what I'm saying, or I'm too romantic?
No, I agree with you 100%. A couple things come to mind that are now fleeing my memory, but one of which, let's see, let me try to get it back. This just reminds me of I had a meeting with a girl, and we were talking about the priesthood, and so I jumped right into the apologetics of the male priesthood. And at the end of it all, she looked at me and she said, yeah, I know, I understand that. That's not a question in my mind. And so the problem of that conversation that I had with her was that I failed to see her as a person to have a dialogue and conversation with, and I saw her as like a problem to be fixed. I projected my image of who she was and what I thought she was thinking onto her, and then bringing up a conversation that may not have been relevant to what she was thinking. And so, like you said, answering questions that haven't been asked, or answering questions that aren't of concern. And so when I think of John Paul II and the personalistic norm of seeing the person as a person and understanding that that person has a story and has thoughts and ideas and opinions that are worth being heard, and to be able to speak to that directly is really important to show that there is individual care invested in that person.
How's that, Mario?
I completely agree with that. And that reminds me also something that Karol Wojtyła comment on his book, Sort of Renewal, one of the documents of the Vatican, Second Vatican Council, which says, well, perhaps it's more important today not what people know rather than how people get to know. So the question at the beginning is the method. How then we go about and approach these people who are living in a culture which observing from a different perspective seems to be completely, let's say, fluid and complicated. So the question is, what is the best method to deal with that? The best method is just to tell them what they ought to be thinking, so that we start with an apologetic, which is clearly more moralistic, rather open the question, let them to raise the question and engage in a dialogue, which is very difficult. I understand that, and sometimes people don't listen very well, and we may listen what we want to be to certain things that we agree. And so I think in that sense, what you're saying, at least to me, make a lot of sense.
Well, yeah, and I mean, along with that too is, sorry, go ahead. We can continue on with the interview conversation.
If a perennial can agree with a millennial, that's progress. That's progress right there.
Yeah.
Now, it seems to me that we can connect back with this language from the document. Mario's saying that we need to listen, and Samantha gives us an example of a situation in which she had a lot to say, but it wasn't what needed to be said, and it wasn't what needed to be said because it wasn't what the student had in mind in the first place. But suppose we look at this language again. Work on gender has been carried out, which tries instead to achieve a deeper understanding of the ways in which sexual difference between men and women is lived out in a variety of cultures. I suppose that work is in large part the work of people who have listened. What's going on in this culture? And how does it differ from what's going on in another culture? And insofar as this listening work has been done in the social sciences, well, of course we would want to engage in dialogue. It's sort of like we come into a situation and other people have been there for a time and we say, what have you been hearing? It's important to ask that. But now if dialogue is always possible there and welcome, there's another possibility. Sometimes what's claimed is this: the only thing that matters in personal relationships is the affection between the individuals involved, irrespective of sexual difference or procreation, which would be seen as irrelevant in the formation of families. And there certainly are people who make this sort of claim. The only thing that matters in personal relationships is the affection, the feelings, the affection between the individuals involved, irrespective of sexual difference or procreation, which would be seen as irrelevant in the formation of families. What dialogue can be done there? The document, as I read it, says there we have to say, well, that's what you think, but we think you're mistaken because.
Right. Yeah, great question. And I mean, that's where so to listen, to reason, and to propose, that's where reasoning and proposing comes into play. With my teens, sometimes they don't have the most rational conclusions to things. So as a society, I think we've lost that art of philosophizing, of critical thinking. It's more emotion-based, emotivism, so making choices and judgments based off of feeling, and those fleeting, changing, non-universal personal principles. And so I think challenging one another to continue asking questions and almost doing a Socratic method of conversation of trying to understand the reason and the logic behind somebody's thinking. And if a person doesn't come to the conclusion on their own, to give that guidance and to offer some some truths in the direction of objective truth.
One of the things, thank you for that, one of the things that needs to get sorted out and that the document does at the very beginning is the relationship between sex and gender.
Mm-hmm.
What's that distinction? How is it developing?
Yeah, so the distinction between sex and gender is a more, I guess, kind of recent separation of terms that used to be synonymous. But I think that in light of heresies that have infiltrated our culture, namely one specific one that I mentioned in my thesis is Gnosticism, where we downplay the value of the body in favor of the soul or mental capacities. And so favoring a person's mental perception of who they are as male or female and kind of dismissing the physical realities that are before us. And so that distinction definitely opened the floodgates to this conversation and possibility of exploring gender theory and gender identity.
What would you add to that, Mario?
Well, yes, this is a very broad topic. But before giving you my take on that, your previous question, I think, is very important. And I want to emphasize something there. When you read the first claim, which was to achieve, I think, deeper understanding the way in which sexual differences between men and men is live out, and men and women live out, in a different variety of culture, it seemed to resemble that claim. Something that may have said for Ruth Benedict or some of these cultural anthropologists. And I think the starting point, I think it's important. I'm not saying you need to stay there, but you begin with something which was very proper, I think, philosophy in the 20th century, which is we are historical beings. We are not abstract beings. We are not just creatures who are pure essences. We live in a very concrete world. And we begin from there, from this description. We don't stay there. We need to somehow elevate our gaze into a more deeper reality or metaphysical reality of ourselves, something more normative, if you want to use this term. And the same thing, the other claim about the people focus too much on affection, and on emotions. And yet that is just part of one aspect of the human condition, which include also the spiritual, the will, the intellect, you name it. So, yes, we need to start from somewhere. And the sign of the times today seems to me, it is that people feel a lot of emotions. I may not like it. I may disagree with that. I may say it's very limited, but I need to start from what people really are experiencing out there. And I think that is important to take into account. And when you read John Paul II, personally norm, which became precise with love. Now, it's not love exclusively as something physical experience rather than a spiritual love, etc., etc. But I think that's it's important to emphasize. Now, going back to gender and sex, I think I see that more two, or let's perhaps three perspectives there. On within the cultural context, when we emphasize too much on sex, we may have an anthropology with strictly naturalist, which fit with modernity. And when you read Hume and you read all these modern thinkers, the emphasis is on nature, and so sex is what defines a human being, being male and female. And so you move to the other perspective, the 20th century, historicism. It's a famous dictum by Ortega y Gasset, the Spanish philosopher, we have no nature but history. And so that's gender. In other words, we are defined by culture, defined by the experiences we are having in a particular time. But again, a personalist view of the human person is not either or. It's an integrated view of the human person, which integrates what I said before. Not only the spiritual aspect, not only the intellectual aspect, also the emotional aspect. It's a unity, it's not a dualism. And so today, perhaps, with the gender theory, or at least some interpretation of gender theory, the emphasis has been exclusively, for intellectual reason, philosophical reason, lack of metaphysics, you name it, is on of gender, on culture. And culture is what defines who we are. And that emphasizes a very autonomous view of human freedom, the free will.
But what we're looking for, is this right? A kind of integration of sex and gender rather than a splitting of the two.
Right, like a holistic view of the person, kind of like that quote that you read earlier about the integration of biological, psychoaffective, social, and spiritual elements in sex education. We need to be sure we're treating the whole person and not reducing the person to parts or components.
Now, what do we, in light of that, what do we make of the increasing use of the term queer? Is there anything associated with that term that's something that we can address, or in the past it's simply been a slur?
Sure, yeah. And that's kind of, I hesitate to answer the question because even in the transgender community, language and vocabulary is always changing. And since it's so focused on since identity is so focused on personal experience and subjective experience, each person has their own kind of interpretation of it. I was reading a book that shared 34 different transgender persons, their stories and their kind of outlooks and perspectives. And at the beginning, the author prefaced by saying that we're going to use these general terms, but these 34 different people are going to have 34 different sorts of interpretations based off of their experience. So the general understanding of the word queer is person who is gender fluid, so kind of floats back and forth between male and female, is my understanding of it. But I could be outdated, who knows, in the last few months that I've done research.
Well, isn't there something funny about being outdated if you're 2 months behind?
Yeah.
It would seem that the person could maybe go on a long trip. 2 months.
Yeah, right, and come back.
Come
on vacation for a weekend, and things are different. Yeah. And that's kind of the language makes conversation and dialogue difficult, which is why it's so important to talk to the person and see what an individual's understanding is of certain language to be able to have that commonality of dialogue.
Now, what if our response is something like this? We're trying to figure out what it is to say that someone is queer, and we talk to the someone, and the someone says, yes, I'm queer, what do you want to know? And we say, well, what does that mean? And the person says, well, sometimes I'm a male, sometimes I'm a female, sometimes I'm a mixture of the two, and it's exciting, it's exhilarating, and I'm queer, I'm loud, I'm proud. And we say, what? I can see then that you are wholly integrated, that you have psychoaffective, social, and spiritual integration. Or do we say, seems to me that the human body is how we're anchored in history, and it seems to me that you're trying to pull up the anchor, and it seems to me that you're in a real difficulty. Would you like to talk some more, or should I say something different? I see that
Well,
perennial there. I see that perennial.
yeah, I have a. What you are saying, Jim, I think is very, very compelling, and bring to my mind a concept which some sociologists are using today in order to describe what's happening in the culture. And they are not using the word queer; they are using the word liquid modernity. Liquid modernity, which was proposed by sociologist Bauman a few years back, and which he described as late modernity as a fertile ground for that's permanent changing in self images and identity. So we are constructing our identity as time passes. And so much so that we have moved from what he may call, or I call, more solid modernity, which try to see ourselves as pilgrims. Or in the Christian tradition, we also can claim that pilgrims go from one place to another.
Mm-hmm.
And not even wanderers, which someone who is lost, but somehow has a sense of the mystery, try to find the way back to his destiny. Rather, fluid modernity has portrayed human being as tourists, people who are doing tourism, looking at one thing, another thing, try one thing, another thing, for fun, but ultimately showing the drama or the tragedy of the human condition, which is somehow trapped in these fleeting social experiences.
And we have to be on the lookout for tourist traps.
Yeah.
And one of the tourist traps is to go someplace that is really there for commercial purposes and not for much of anything else. At the same time, if we're going to talk about real pilgrimages to real sites, then we have to articulate what's there really. And well, here's a way to begin to do that. Is there something distinctive about femininity? Is there something distinctive about masculinity? How about beginning with femininity? Is there something distinctive, not just biologically, although to say not just is a poor way of speaking. Is there something that we could say is the feminine genius? What do you think, Samantha?
I think that there are definitely tendencies and gifts that the Lord has given women that He hasn't given men. Obviously, there's complementarity in our gifts, right? And we can look to Our Lady as a clear model of like the climax of what it means to be a woman. But I mean, starting with, like we talked about it earlier, and Christian anthropology and John Paul II with theology of the body, of understanding where we came from, what our origins are, where we're going. And so, and knowing those two things, we understand how to live today. And so God creating woman with, in the Garden of Eden, to be a helpmate for man. And my understanding is that helpmate is translated to azer, which means to make holy. So having that relational aspect and that nurturing aspect is where we came from. And where we're going is communion with God. And so how do we use our gifts of nurturing, of making holy, of receptivity in between the destination and our starting point is kind of the question. And each woman is going to live that out differently depending on the gifts that the Lord has given her and her vocation of how she is called to carry those gifts out in the world.
So it's not as if, is this right? It's not as if the human person is split between the feminine and the masculine in some rigid fashion, but rather there's a complementarity between the feminine and the masculine. And the feminine itself is integral, and the masculine itself is integral. It's not as if there's this job description and one job description goes out to women and another job description goes out to men. In a sense, it's the same job description, realize fully your personal and human dimensions, but there'll be differences in the way these dimensions are realized.
Correct, yeah. And I think something that those who subscribe to gender dysphoria and transgender may misunderstand is their conception of gender is on a continuum, so they're of extremes of male and female, and that everyone has a place on the continuum, implying that to be male is opposite from being female, and female being opposite of being male. But the way that I've read it and understand it is that they're less on the same continuum, and they're their kind of own measurements. They're like parallel lines in their own right, and different modes of being. So, because when we look at gender on a continuum, it's based on behavior, and there's a lack involved. But we're all created as male and female, given everything that we need to live in love for the Lord, and equipped in that manner. So we're not lacking in anything. It's just a matter of living that masculinity and femininity, that maleness and femaleness to our fullest.
I could add here for people who are interested in more reading, and I know all master students are interested in more reading, and all teachers are in more reading so that they can assign more reading. There's a truly great lady, Sister Prudence Allen, who is about to celebrate her 80th birthday. And,
yay!
She is going to celebrate it in part by publishing the third volume of her magnum opus, The Concept of Women. And I was mentioning to my wife Elizabeth this morning that the first person I heard discussing carefully with real acuity the whole notion of the struggle to integrate sex and gender was Sister Prudence Allen. And I think she did so as a member of the International Theological, I want to say committee, but that's not the right word for it, that serves the Holy See. So Sister Prudence Allen is somebody who works for this notion of not a truncated femininity somehow completing a truncated masculinity, but rather an integral femininity and an integral masculinity. And her idea is always integration rather than splitting off. Now, all of this sort of discussion, and Mario has already given us a sneak preview, takes us to this notion of anthropology. And I think the great majority of Americans today, when they hear the term anthropology, think of it as one of the social sciences. And they think of it as something entirely empirical insofar as it's showing its cards. It's entirely empirical. But there's a deeper sense of anthropology. And well, Mario, maybe you could take us back to that and look to, as you take us back to that, to an anthropology that would be at the deepest levels dualistic rather than integrative.
Well, you are right. There is a misperception of anthropology, which people confuse with cultural anthropology or sociology. Where we are talking about, I think the document emphasized here is a philosophical anthropology, which must be an integral anthropology. Perhaps, I don't know if that's the case, but that sounds to me the language of Jacques Maritain in his integral humanism. But again, there is a tradition within the Peronist philosophy about this integrated view of reality, which has the human being, the microcosmos, as a center. Not the only center, but it's the center, somehow condense all reality. Now, if that then is the case, this integral anthropology tried to harmonize not only the physical, the psychological, the spiritual dimension, but yet there is a prior to that view, a view which we can trace back to the ancient Greeks, Plato, or some others, pre-Socratics, which has a different view, and also many modern, a different view, which is somehow reduce human being to separate component or dimension, the material and the spiritual. And so when one emphasizes too much, you have naturalism, and another emphasizes too much, you have culturalism. So in somehow they are in the same individual, but separated. I don't want to get into many details on this, but this is a very dualistic, I think Samantha mentioned, it's a very Gnostic view of the human person, which is generally is widespread, but I think it's widespread not because people are really aware of what dualism is, rather than that is what is in the culture, the affection, the irrationality, the emotion. And so this view, somehow, the dualistic view, fit more in that very superficial view of the human person. So I think we have a very big job here in educating, in proposing this, what I call the personalist view of the human person, personalist view of the human sexuality. And that's we need to do, and I think the document mentioned in a democratic setting, which today, unfortunately, is becoming more and more totalitarian, in the sense that somehow doesn't allow more than one view of the human person. So, but this is, I think, is our mission today, being witness of this view, more integrated, less dualist of the human person.
Here's a little sampler of examples that point to this mistaken dualistic anthropology, an anthropology that separates the body from the will. And as the document says, when you have that separation of the body from the will, you're open to a kind of a physicalism on the side of the body and a voluntarism on the side of the will, if either is given the complete sway. Some examples. We go to visit our great-grandmother in the hospital, perhaps, and someone says, "She's really not there anymore." Well, of course, she is there. It's just that she has some profound disabilities that come with age and disease, and she can't express herself in the way that we're used to her expressing herself. But to say that she, that is to say, her intelligence, because she is nothing more than her intelligence, or she, her will, because she is nothing more than her will, she is not there any longer, well, that, of course, opens the way to euthanasia. Or at the opposite end, we have, well, at this stage in the fetus, oh, how technical, in this stage in fetal development, we don't have the foundation yet for intelligence or will. So what we have here is maybe a precursor of the human person, but we do not yet have a person. And that, of course, opens the way to abortion. Or in every B movie or C television show, we have some line that goes like, well, yes, we had sex, but it was just physical. It didn't mean anything. Well, of course it meant something. It meant that you were unfaithful. It meant that you were cheating. It meant that you were establishing a profound personal bond with another that you didn't plan to build on. And it meant that you failed, really, to keep your vows. So it's so easy for the false dualistic, hard dualism anthropology to lead to more moral errors of a pervasive sort. And yet to counter that, we have to do some serious philosophy. And I think Mario and I and other guests have oftentimes commented on the uphill battle of doing serious philosophy in a culture that trivializes. But maybe here we could do some serious philosophy if we looked at this distinction, which really goes back to, in terms of the actual phrasing, the distinction that goes back to something that Samantha cited earlier. Karol Wojtyła, then Karol Wojtyła's Love and Responsibility. He distinguishes between the order of nature and the order of biology. What's that distinction getting at? The floor is open. The distinction between the order of nature and the order of biology.
Should I jump in?
Sure. And then
right.
Push Samantha. After you jump in, we'll push her in.
I just saw it and a concept that I'm still wrestling with and trying to formulate myself. So I'd be really interested to hear your insights on this, Mario.
We're not hearing you that clearly now.
Oh, man.
All right, now we are. Now we are.
Okay, super. I was just saying that this distinction is still something that I'm kind of wrestling with. So I would be really interested on your guidance in these notions, Mario.
Well, I think I mentioned in passing already when I was describing the view of modernity. What I understand, the order of biology, if you look at the history of intellectual thought from Descartes on, there is an emphasis on the physical aspect of nature. So nature is whatever Ortega said, whatever you can measure, whatever you can weigh, whatever you can see. So it's more empirical. And so if you reduce nature to that, then human freedom and every other reality, which is metaphysical, even ethic, is subjected to this materialism. So that is a very reduced view of nature. And it's a very reduced view of reason as well. Whereas in the classic, if you go back to Aquinas, even Aristotle, then the view of nature include, yes, the material dimension, and yet it's not that all, so that there are other aspects of reality which make nature being not only material, but also, let's say, spiritual or metaphysical. In other words, a more holistic view of nature. And so when we move forward up to the 21st century, it seems that not only physical nature is questioned, not only the classical view of nature is questioned or forgotten. Today, reality is completely denied for whatever metaphysical prejudices, and you have everything is culture, everything is history. So in some ways, giving this a big sketch, if you very sketch of history, you say, well, we have moved from a more comprehensive view of nature, then more reduced understanding of nature with modernity, and post-modernity neither. And so what is, again, our mission? Well, to somehow repropose that is not either or, is not just pure culture, is not pure physical nature. It is an integrated reality. So we need somehow to repropose, I would say, classical realism.
And if we have a convergence of theology and philosophical realism, we can then push to, and Samantha's already given us a sneak preview of this, the roots of Christian anthropology. Where do we find the roots of Christian anthropology?
Yeah, I think that, well, God spoke volumes in Genesis, for sure, in creation, in creating us male and female, our origin, and then giving man and woman to each other as a sort of one flesh union, imaging the communion of the Trinity of Father, Son, and Holy Spirit. So our origin being created male and female, and our goal and purpose to image the communion of persons in the Trinity, and how we live that out in between is through charity and really willing the good of the other for the sake of the other in love. And so really just modeling what God has already set before us. Obviously easier said than done, but I think the blueprint is pretty clear.
So it's really a biblical foundation, and it's a biblical foundation that through centuries of reflective dialogue has come to express itself in a kind of broad kind of philosophical realism. It's in this context that in a fundamental way, we know, male and female, we know who we are, and we, in this fundamental context, can come to be most fully who we are. And here I think of someone who so often comes to mind, and that's G.K. Chesterton. Mm-hmm. Chesterton has this wonderful short essay called In Defense of Rash Vows. Now, you know, he's given to paradox. He's really not defending rash vows, but he's defending vows. And in the contemporary intellectual moral climate, the very notion of vows needs to be defended. And what he says is, we're wary of vows, we're dismissive of vows, because in the end, to make a vow is to make a date with yourself and the other at a future point. And if you don't know who you're going to be in the future, and if you don't know who the other is going to be in the future, well, it would be rash to make a date to be with your other at some future point. But in fact, we know who we are fundamentally. We know that it's a great ongoing everyday struggle to fully realize our identity, but we do know who we are. We are male, we are female, we are not totally fluid identities. If you're a totally fluid identity, you can't really encounter another person. And if you can't encounter another person, you cannot realize the person that you yourself are. And sometimes all of this is understood, and sometimes in our own time, I think it's not much understood at all. Now, I've got a whole paragraph. Well, that's cheating. It's not a whole paragraph, because a whole paragraph from this document would be an awful long paragraph. But I do have one paragraph that I'd like to read from the document, Male and Female, He Created Them. And I think this paragraph connects us with where we came into our discussion on this panel. What are we doing with our education? And connects us with a point that Mario has made just a few moments ago, about how education takes place in the context of a political order. So here goes the paragraph. The culture of dialogue, which of course the document emphasizes, to listen, to reason, and to propose. The culture of dialogue does not in any way contradict the legitimate aspirations of Catholic schools to maintain their own vision of human sexuality. In keeping with the right of families to freely base the education of their children upon an integral anthropology, capable of harmonizing the human person's physical, psychic, and spiritual identity. Now the political dimension. In fact, a democratic state cannot reduce the range of education on offer to a single school of thought. All the more so in relation to this extremely delicate subject, human sexuality, which is concerned on the one hand with the fundamentals of human nature, and on the other with the natural rights of parents, natural in that they come before any political right, and on the other with the natural rights of parents to freely choose any educational model that accords with the dignity of the human person. Now, gentle listeners, Mario and Samantha, they have this text in front of them, and we appreciate that it's not easy to digest on a single hearing, but I'll bear you the burden of hearing me read it again. I'll just ask Samantha and Mario to tease out the implications for us and for their ministries of this paragraph from male and female, he created them.
Yeah, it's a very rich paragraph, so there's so much to say. But just to kind of reiterate, the family being a communion of persons, the relationship of a mother and father and a child, and how, again, the family also images the Trinity as Father, Son, and Holy Spirit. So that goes again into our vocation of imaging the communion of persons by living through our masculinity and femininity. And I think that's something that we kind of take for granted in culture today is our identities, with our bodies, as it says in Theology of the Body, the sacramentality of the body, and we're able to make visible the invisible mysteries of God. So there's this greatness that you're given the capacity for. And so with that greatness comes a responsibility, and that responsibility comes the sacrifice, and there's love involved. And those are very challenging calls for us. And it's a matter, so when we embrace our identity as men and women, as sons and daughters of God, we're also embracing the responsibility to be brother and sister for one another and to draw one another into communion with God, which is a lofty goal and topic. But that aspect of the family and responsibility that comes with the family, I think, is one worth noting there.
Yes. And Mario.
Yes, I deal with this issue almost every day in my classes because I think my method has been let the students ask their questions which are in their heart, their own experiences. And so, but that's not all. From this question, I propose different claims, and I propose the claim that I know is more reasonable, which you say, well, is the Christian claim, the tradition of classical realism. But just a proposal, and it's the job of the student. I tell them that they are the protagonists of their own history. In other words, this claim will be true only if they themselves verify the claim that is true in reality. If they go out there and verify by themselves the true what I'm saying, then it's true for them. They are going to own. They are going to absorb this claim. It's not because I said so, it's I say, but I expect them to not recreate, reabsorb for themselves. So they are going to have the task of moving forward and testing this claim. If this claim are true, then they are going to continue ask question about the Christian faith. So I think it's an open way of dealing with this issue in a democratic setting. We don't stop just with the broader question. We just propose, but letting always the freedom of the learner, so to speak, the one who verify by themselves, not because we said so, just because what what we are saying is correspond to reality, which is a very classical view of truth.
Yes. Let me, and now we are getting a little bit close to the end of the hour, but let me reread the second half of this paragraph and then apply it to the Golden State, if only it were California, where I live. In fact, the document says a democratic state cannot reduce the range of education on offer to a single school of thought, all the more so in relation to this extremely delicate subject. Now, a comment. In the state of California, public education mandates a kind of all-inclusive, non-discriminating, as it were, sex education. And the sex education treats homosexuality and heterosexuality and bisexuality and the blurring of all three as legitimate, perfectly legitimate options. And to explain these options and to explain the sexual practices that go with these options is part and parcel of public health. And anyone who doesn't see this really isn't democratic, because in order to be truly democratic, you have to put out all the options and treat them from a supposed stance of neutrality. But of course, the stance isn't one of neutrality. And then the document, going back to what it continues with, extremely delicate subject, which is concerned on the one hand with the fundamentals of human nature, and on the other with natural rights of parents to freely choose any educational model that accords with the dignity of the human person. Now, in fact, Catholics cannot really choose any educational model because the law requires them to pay for, by way of taxes, to pay for an educational model that flatly contradicts the teachings of a document like male and female, he created them. And furthermore, the state of California makes homeschooling very, very difficult. So in terms of the democratic state, it seems to me that in this area of sex education, we don't have a democratic state. It's a fiction to suppose that we do. And it's important that Catholics who seek to dialogue with this state in terms of the state of California, in terms of sex education, ought to be extremely aware of just what's at issue. And I think for the most part, we're not. I think for the most part, we're sort of aware that it's sort of a problem, but we're not really up to speed. And a close reading of this document, I think, will be a great help to us. Now, I'd like to end with a prayer, and customarily we end with the prayer that is the gospel reading from the liturgy of the day. This is from the gospel according to Matthew. Jesus said to his disciples, in praying, do not babble like the pagans who think they will be heard because of their many words. Do not be like them. Your Father knows what you need before you ask him. This is how you ought to pray. Our Father who art in heaven, hallowed be thy name. Thy kingdom come, thy will be done on earth as it is in heaven. Give us this day our daily bread, and forgive us our trespasses, as we forgive those who trespass against us. And lead us not into temptation, but deliver us from evil. If you forgive others their transgressions, your heavenly Father will forgive you. But if you do not forgive others, neither will your Father forgive your transgressions. The Gospel of the Lord. Thanks,
Thanks.
Samantha, for joining us. And thank you, Mario, for being here as always. And thank you, gentle listeners, for joining us. We'll be back in another week with another podcast, and its focus will be on the great books. The great books provide a fascinating way of education.
Thank you.
We hope you enjoyed the program and will join us back for another show on WCAT Radio. This is Sebastian Mahfood. Good day.